A young man sat on a fallen log next to a muddy forest stream. A multitude of moss and other epiphytes clung to the surrounding tree trunks and branches. Not far away, the man's family gathered snails and mussels at the water's edge. None of them wore much clothing. By his bare feet, 2 turtles wrestled inside a woven bag. Easy prey destined for the nightly campfire. But now, this man was busy with a different prize collected from the stream. In his right hand, he held a smooth, rounded stone, chosen for its flat oval shape and size, slightly larger than his palm. With another stone, he began striking the cobble's edge, moving methodically around its circumference, always napping from the same side, a technique that had been used by his ancestors for dozens of generations. As he napped the cobble, small flakes fell, debris which he swept away with his feet. After a couple minutes, he had transformed the round cobble into a small axe head, sharp yet sturdy. He slipped the stone into his bag, and a couple days later would use it to chop down a narrow, straight tree stem, from which to fashion a spear. Although turtle and shellfish collecting was reliable, deer hunting with wooden spears provided larger bounties and greater renown within his clan, a clan adapted to life in tropical forests. This man lived 30,000 years ago in Thailand and belonged to an astoundingly long-lasting tradition of producing axe-like tools from river cobbles. We know little about the cultures that utilized this tool-making method, but it seems to have been one of the earliest technological innovations made by our species in Southeast Asia. Welcome to Our Prehistory, Episode 36, Hoabinhian and Indian Microlithic. The early prehistory of our species is one of diversification, genetically, linguistically, and culturally. About 20,000 years after we left Africa, bands of Homo sapiens had reached most of Eurasia and Sahul. At the start of this process of expansion, the out-of-Africa migrants likely shared a similar ancestry, language, and set of customs. But by 40,000 years ago, separation had forged differences. Ancient DNA and artifacts from this period revealed distinct genetic and cultural trajectories in different regions of the so-called Old World. So far, we have examined the initial cultures of Europe, Northeast Asia, and Sahul. Now, we move on to South and Southeast Asia to explore the unique paths taken by humankind in warmer latitudes of Eurasia, covering the land between Pakistan in the west and Indonesia in the east. In the following episodes, we will learn about tremendous technological stability, ancient rainforest societies, maritime networks, and exciting recent discoveries of sophisticated paintings, older than those of Europe. As we start this journey, it quickly becomes apparent that the prehistory of these regions differs starkly from that of northern Eurasia in one major respect. In South and Southeast Asia, changes in stone tools were remarkably rare for long stretches of time. Whereas in Europe and Northern Asia, cultural periods are defined by types of stone tools, this is not possible for the Pleistocene of South and Southeast Asia. The reasons for this will be the subject of today's episode, but it means that a chronological structure doesn't make much sense for this series. Instead, we will spend each episode on a different topic. First, regional technological variation. Second, adaptations to tropical and maritime environments. Third, rock art. And fourth, the terminal Pleistocene period, when cultural shifts become visible in the archaeological record. Today, we begin by laying out the cultural distinctions within South and Southeast Asia, based primarily on types of stone tools used by Homo sapiens. From this information, we can divide our area of interest into three smaller regions: the Indian subcontinent, the mainland of Southeast Asia, and the islands of Southeast Asia. In each of these regions, dramatically different types of stone tools were used. At times, I will refer to the Indian subcontinent as South Asia, and that is where we will begin today. Our understanding of the prehistory of the Indian subcontinent is seriously hampered by a lack of dated human fossils. Discoveries of stone tools abound and demonstrate that intelligent hominins occupied this part of the world for millions of years. However, the oldest known fossils belonging to our species are only 35,000 years old, a date which comes well after Homo sapiens first entered this region. Older than this, only a single skull of unclear date is known. It might belong to Homo heidelbergensis, the evolutionary ancestor of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. This means that we don't have a clear sense of when our species first lived in South Asia, nor do we know which species of hominin lived there before us. Both are unfortunate and significant blind spots in our knowledge regarding the dispersal of Homo sapiens across Eurasia. This uncertainty extends to the archaeological remains, which reveal significant changes in stone tools, occurring at two different times. First, around 80,000 years ago, when prepared core tools, like those of Middle Paleolithic Europe and Middle Stone Age Africa, became common. The second major shift began around 48,000 years ago, when Microlithic tools first appeared. There is no agreement among experts as to whether one of these technological transitions marks the arrival of Homo sapiens. However, most agree that after the second transition, Microlithic tools were primarily made by Homo sapiens. Today, we will focus on the Microlithic period of South Asian prehistory, the first cultural period which can reasonably be attributed to our species. The oldest known Microlithic tools appear 48,000 years ago in two separate locations, central India and the island of Sri Lanka, off the southern tip of the Indian subcontinent. Interestingly, these seem to have been isolated inventions of notably small stone tools, each taking on a distinct form. In central India, groups of foragers began making specialized cores from which to knap narrow bladelets, only about 1 centimeter wide and less than 4 centimeters long. At the same time, larger blades and stone chisels increased in frequency. In Sri Lanka, on the other hand, people made small flake tools, about 2 centimeters wide by 2 centimeters long, using more simplistic knapping sequences, including a hammer and anvil technique. In some cases, the foragers of Sri Lanka converted these tiny flakes into geometric shapes, usually crescents. For several millennia, bladelets coexisted in India with the preceding types of stone tools, those made from prepared cores, including the Levallois type. But around 35,000 years ago, a significant shift occurred within the cultural landscape. Older methods of knapping fell out of use, and all forager groups adopted the Microlithic approach, including those living along the Indo-Gangetic Plain in the north and the Deccan Plateau in the south. At their camps, people made larger quantities of bladelets. Furthermore, improvements in Microlithic toolmaking spread, including the use of backing, or blunting of the edges, to alter the shape of the bladelets. Backing allows for more effective hafting. With this technique, people increasingly converted bladelets into standardized geometric shapes, like those of Sri Lanka. One especially distinctive type of back tool appeared, which remained a defining element of Indian culture for thousands of years. These were curved-backed points, bladelets with one curved edge and one straight edge, perhaps used as tips of light projectile weapons. Indian curved-backed points were similar to arrowheads that became common in Europe several millennia later, during the process of Azilianization. Beyond microlithization and standardization of stone tools, evidence of symbolic behavior among hunter-gatherer societies also begins to appear around this time. Discoveries of Pleistocene-aged ornaments and art are extremely rare on the Indian subcontinent, but seem to coincide with the spread of microlithic tools. For example, people in Sri Lanka made beads from marine shells, going back to 37,000 years ago. In India, fragments of red ochre were ground into powder, and beads were crafted from stone, bone, and ostrich eggshell. At one of the oldest known burials in India, the dead body had been placed in the grave with eggshell beads around its neck. Much like East Africa and North Asia, in India, ostrich eggshell was one of the first materials adapted for ornamental purposes by humans, including to make circular beads in all three regions. Furthermore, one of the few pieces of art from the Indian subcontinent dated to the Pleistocene is a small fragment of ostrich eggshell, into which a person inscribed a simple cross-hatched design, reminiscent of the oldest known African art. These cross-continental similarities in simple symbolic artifacts don't necessarily reflect direct cultural descent or interaction. Instead, they represent shared instincts in early humans, the way their brains and hands worked, the way their societies functioned, and the natural materials at their disposal often led to similar outcomes. The appearance of symbolic behavior and widespread adoption of microlithic tools has been linked by some prehistorians to environmental change. Around 35,000 years ago, rainfall decreased in several parts of India. Pollen records show an increase in grassland at the expense of woodlands. This marked the beginning of a decline that would peak thousands of years later during the last glacial maximum, a period of aridity providing fewer resources to human foragers. It's theorized that in response, South Asians made more complex hafted tools and weapons with backed bladelets, crescents, and curved-backed points, presumably an investment in more effective tools to compensate for mounting obstacles to their survival. This association between a harsh environment and the invention, spread, and standardization of microlithic technology is one shared with other prehistoric human cultures. The shift toward greater reliance on bladelets is roughly contemporaneous with a wider shift toward tiny stone tools in Africa, Europe, and most of Asia. Yet, the Microlithic period of South Asia holds a unique place in the larger global landscape. The methods used to make Indian bladelets were not similar to those of nearby regions, such as Central Asia. People in South Asia did not create boat-shaped cores, ubiquitous in other parts of Eurasia. Bladelets emerged locally on the Indian subcontinent, which had significant geographic barriers to the west and north. This separation from the rest of Eurasia might have also affected the prehistoric trajectory of South Asia in another way. Unlike in other parts of the world where microliths became common, the hunter-gatherers of India maintained a consistent approach to stone toolmaking for an extraordinary amount of time. It would not be until 3,000 years ago, well into the Holocene, that backed bladelets, curved-backed points, and crescents fell out of use. This degree of stability in stone tool traditions is unknown in most of Eurasia during this period. A stark reminder that in some parts of the world, the prehistory of our species is not a story of change, but of mind-blowing millennial perpetuation of ancient customs. At the eastern end of the Indian subcontinent lie the Indo-Myanmar Mountains. This relatively low range, running north to south, is the approximate boundary between two biomes, with tropical rainforests to the east and drier woodlands to the west. Interestingly, these mountains also represent the boundary between two prehistoric cultural regions, a threshold which existed both before and after the arrival of Homo sapiens. To the east of the Indo-Myanmar Mountains in Southeast Asia, hominins never adopted the use of prepared core tools during the Middle Paleolithic, nor blades or bladelets during the Late Paleolithic. Instead, human hunter-gatherers preferred a type of more simply made stone tool. These Southeast Asian tools are known to archaeologists as cobble tools because they were primarily made from rounded river stones. Typically, humans, including both Homo sapiens and more archaic species, only struck these cobbles a small number of times to remove flakes. This approach produced a small number of irregular flakes, and the remaining piece of the cobble, sometimes referred to as a chopper, due to its relatively large mass. Cobble tools were primarily used by hominins living in Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, and southern China. It's probably not a coincidence that the geographic extent of choppers coincided with that of tropical forest. This environment posed a dramatically different challenge to humans than the drier woodlands and grasslands of India, and thus they adapted a much different, less time-consuming approach to stone knapping. A popular, but not universally agreed upon theory is that hominins living in Southeast Asia did not rely as heavily on stone tools as those in the rest of Asia, because they had access to a rich variety of plant materials, in particular bamboo. Bamboo stems are a remarkably adaptable material for crafting and can be converted into containers, woven mats, pointed spearheads, and even reasonably sharp knives. So perhaps stone choppers and irregular flakes were mostly used to fashion tools and hunting weapons from organic materials. This is known as the bamboo hypothesis, and might explain why, as Homo sapiens dispersed from the Indian subcontinent into wetter ecosystems of Southeast Asia, they abandoned stone-knapping methods of their ancestors and borrowed the approach of indigenous hominins, who had inhabited the region for hundreds of thousands of years. But interestingly, the cobble tools of Southeast Asia did not remain completely unchanged. Several thousand years after the arrival of our species, a sign of ingenuity appeared. A new tradition emerged, boasting more standardized stone tools. They formed a unique tropical toolkit, still made primarily from cobbles, and its most iconic component was the Sumatralith. Sumatraliths were heavy-duty stone tools made from flat, oval-shaped cobbles, usually between 10 and 15 centimeters long. To make them, stone knappers removed flakes from the entire edge from one face of the stone. Alongside Sumatraliths, people also utilized simple flakes, scrapers, and hammerstones. The appearance of Sumatraliths marks the beginning of a new group of cultures, which archaeologists refer to as Hoabinhian cultures, after the Hoa Binh province of Vietnam, where several sites with Sumatraliths have been discovered. Hoabinhian tools probably shared a similar purpose as older cobble tools, namely woodworking, but took the form of more finely crafted axes. Sumatraliths were typically made from coarse-grained varieties of rock. Unlike fine-grained stones, such as obsidian or chert, coarse-grained stones don't make especially sharp cutting edges, but they do produce resilient edges, less prone to breaking, supporting the idea that chopping was the main function of this Hoabinhian tool. Sumatraliths may represent a parallel to other axe-like stone tools of the Pleistocene, such as the core axes of the Congo Basin, wasted axes of New Guinea, and ground edge axes of northern Australia and Japan. Much like the Microlithic period in India, the Hoabinhian lasted a long time. The oldest Sumatraliths were discovered in southern China and northern Vietnam, and are 43,000 and 33,000 years old, respectively. As with the microliths of India, Hoabinhian tools coexisted with the preceding stone knapping methods for more than 10,000 years. In other words, while some bands of foragers in Southeast Asia were using Sumatraliths, others continued to rely on choppers. Hoabinhian tools only became prevalent in the millennia following the last glacial maximum, as temperatures rose and tropical forests expanded. Amazingly, the Hoabinhian toolkit remained dominant in Southeast Asia well into the Holocene. It was only about 4,000 years ago that these customs were replaced by a different system of making tools, with the arrival of agricultural groups from other parts of Asia. The Hoabinhian was the first cultural period of Southeast Asia that belonged exclusively to Homo sapiens. Despite inhabiting this large region for tens of thousands of years, the people of Hoabinhian cultures left few descendants living today. Genetic studies show that they contributed some ancestry to small, geographically isolated ethnic groups still living in Southeast Asia, such as the Onge of the Andaman Islands, the Semang of Malaysia, and the Aeta of the Philippines, who all share a relatively dark complexion and hunter-gatherer lifeway. Beyond the making of Sumatraliths, we know little about the Pleistocene ancestors of these people. Only a handful of ornaments have been discovered from this period, including large tooth pendants at 2 Vietnamese sites, one of which was around 20,000 years old. Discoveries of art are limited to basic linear incisions on stone blocks, and the only other signs of symbolic activity are that of ground ochre and human burials, which have been found at 5 sites in Vietnam and Thailand, ranging from 21,000 to 13,000 years old. Hoabinhian cultures of the Pleistocene remain largely mysterious. Unlike other contemporaneous societies, the material remains from these people are so scarce and frustratingly restricted to stone that their hunting and gathering practices, social dynamics, demography, and ideology remain elusive. If we can glean anything from the distribution of their unique stone tools, it's that the Hoabinhian was a long-lasting cultural realm, different from those to their west, north, and south. Their distinct technological traditions hint at a tropical forest society remaining isolated and maintaining a shared sense of tribal identity. Moving south and east from the mainland portion of Southeast Asia, we encounter thousands of islands, from the large, like Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and Sulawesi, to the small and tiny. Most of these islands belong to the modern countries of Indonesia and the Philippines, and are collectively referred to as Island Southeast Asia. Early human cultures that formed in this region can be distinguished from those of the mainland. But before we explore those societies, we must first address a crucial geographical phenomenon. This issue, as you might surmise, relates to the level of the world's oceans during the Pleistocene. The map of this region was radically different during the last ice age, when sea levels were lower than they are today, up to 120 meters lower. As a result, many of today's islands were not islands, but part of the mainland, part of a much larger Southeast Asian peninsula. Most of Indonesia was linked by a wide land bridge to Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Continental Asia projected an additional 1,500 kilometers to the southeast. This prehistoric peninsula is known to geologists as Sunda. Sunda, much like the prehistoric continent of Sahul, provided much more space for humans to live than this region does today. This extra piece of the Asian mainland was almost the size of Europe, but today only half of its land remains above water. As the earliest members of our species entered Sunda, they encountered land covered by a mixture of tropical grassland and forest, an environment that had the potential to support a robust human population. Unfortunately, archaeological discoveries that date to the Pleistocene are few and far between on the remaining portions of Sunda. Therefore, most of our knowledge about the oldest human cultures in this region comes from the parts of Southeast Asia in the east that were never connected to the mainland. Those perpetual islands are known today as the Philippine and Wallaceian archipelagos. Despite their geographic separation, the human cultures that emerged on those islands retained some similarities to their counterparts on the mainland of Sunda. That cultural connection is revealed in their art, which we will explore in a future episode. But today we will focus on the similarity that can be seen in their use of stone. Heavy, cobble-based Hoabinhian tools were not adapted by Homo sapiens living in Sunda, the Philippines, or Wallacea. The large choppers of mainland Southeast Asia were less common here, a notable but unexplained difference in technological approach. Instead, People in these regions primarily made smaller flake tools, expedient, rarely made by any sophisticated core preparation, irregularly shaped, and seldom retouched. Those few that were intentionally modified are mostly classified as scrapers and notched tools by archaeologists. This toolkit of small irregular flakes most resembles contemporaneous tools in southern Sahul and northern China. And much like in Australia, the absence of defined stone tool types lasted well into the Holocene. Once again, we find a tremendous persistence of a stone knapping tradition, much as with bladelets in South Asia and Sumatraliths in mainland Southeast Asia. Despite the simplicity of stone tools, archaeological remains show subtle signs of innovation after the arrival of Homo sapiens. First, on the Wallaceian Islands, where the Pleistocene record of human activity is most well known, there was an increase in the use of fine-grained rock, especially chert, which created especially sharp edges. It's hypothesized that this change occurred when Homo sapiens replaced the preceding hominin occupants of certain Wallaceian islands. Furthermore, on some islands flakes became smaller, averaging 2 centimeters long, likely used in compound hafted tools. At one cave on the island of Flores, the shift to chert tools was dated to 47,000 years ago. Prior to this date, this island was occupied by a species of small-statured hominin, the 3.5-foot-tall Homo floresiensis. The presence of Homo sapiens is also marked by the introduction of tools made from bone and shell, which began to appear around 40,000 years ago. People started making bone spear or arrow points in Borneo and Sulawesi, and shell flakes in the Philippines and Wallacea. Our species, as in other parts of the world, carved organic materials to make complex tools. The oldest curved fishhooks are between 23,000 and 16,000 years old from the island of Timor, and the oldest straight and pointed fishing gorges are more than 33,000 years old from the Philippines. Both made from shell, this fishing gear is among the oldest known in the world, indicating the importance of marine resources on islands to the east of Sunda. Beyond technological innovation, both Sunda and Wallacea witnessed profound changes in symbolic behavior on their hominin inhabitants. Around 40,000 years ago, fragments of red ochre that had been ground to powder became a common item left behind at camps in this region. To a lesser extent, shell beads appear among the refuse of Wallaceian foragers. Pigments were used to color those beads and to paint rock walls with images that have now been dated as far back as 51,000 years ago in Sulawesi. When combined with the appearance of ornaments and bone tools, these rock paintings demonstrate that island Southeast Asia holds evidence of many behavioral signatures associated with the arrival of Homo sapiens in other parts of the world. Taking a step back and looking at what we have learned thus far about South and Southeast Asia, we can draw a couple main conclusions about the human societies of the Pleistocene. Both conclusions differentiate the prehistory of this region from that of northern Eurasia. First, the arrival of Homo sapiens is not obviously marked in the archaeological record. We know that members of our species had traveled through this part of the world before 50,000 years ago, because Homo sapiens reached Australia and New Guinea by that date. Yet, it's difficult to point toward any changes in stone tools or other types of artifacts in South and Southeast Asia that are more than 50,000 years old. As we have seen today, significant cultural shifts seemingly come after that date, such as the appearance of microliths in India and Sri Lanka around 48,000 years ago, Sumatraliths in southern China 43,000 years ago, and complex rock art in Sulawesi 51,000 years ago. These events occurred well after the initial dispersal of Homo sapiens, and therefore are not likely to be the signature of those migrations. Future discoveries might uncover older signs of our species, but for now, the timing, route, and extent of the spread of Homo sapiens through the southern half of Asia remains shrouded in uncertainty. The second conclusion regarding the Pleistocene cultures of South and Southeast Asia is that they demonstrate striking technological continuity. Microliths in India, Hoabinhian Sumatraliths, and small amorphous flake tools in island Southeast Asia were all in use between 40,000 and 5,000 years ago. Remarkably, these traditions even transcended the environmental changes at the end of the Ice Age. Tool-making practices were passed down faithfully for more than 1,000 generations, unlike in northern Eurasia, where innovations appeared and spread repeatedly during the Pleistocene. In Europe, foragers invented Solutrean bifacial stone points around 26,000 years ago, at the same time that microblade technology was spreading through East Asia and Siberia. Then, as the planet warmed after the last glacial maximum, blades were replaced by flake tools in Europe, and microblades fell out of use in East Asia. These were fundamental reorganizations of approaches to knapping stone tools, reorganizations seemingly absent among the hunter-gatherer societies of South and Southeast Asia. The only other place we have explored thus far where people maintained stone-making methods for a similar period was Australia. So what does this tell us about the earliest prehistory of our species? Was there some fundamental difference between the societies of northern and southern Eurasia, which would explain this astounding technological stability in the south and repeated change in the north? One plausible answer is that stone tools were less important to the people living in southern Eurasia. This idea relates to basic geographic and climatic factors. Places where stone tool types remained more stable were closer to the equator. Modern studies have revealed that hunter-gatherers in tropical locations tend to eat more plant food as a proportion of their diet than those living in temperate climates. This greater reliance on plants for food may have meant that stone knives for hunting and butchering animals were less important, especially if tropical foragers hunted smaller animals, requiring less intensive butchery. In some tropical locations, we have evidence of this dependence on small animals. Additionally, in warmer climates, clothing was less essential for survival. Thus, knives and scrapers for working hides were not necessary in most of southern Asia. Furthermore, some prehistorians theorize that tools made from wood and plant fiber were especially important to the hunter-gatherers of tropical forests and savannas, where a greater variety of plants was available. If this is the case, if people in southern Asia crafted more tools from plants and fewer from rocks than those in the north, then attempts at innovation may have focused on improving the organic components of their toolkit, which are not preserved in the archaeological record. On the other hand, in the north, foragers may have placed greater emphasis on having efficient stone weapons and tools. Essentially, differences in the types of resources available to early human cultures might explain fundamental differences in the stability of stone tool traditions. In addition to the different types of plants and animals in temperate and tropical ecosystems, another geographic factor might help explain the lack of cultural change in southern Eurasia, namely the lower magnitude of climate change during the Pleistocene. As the world went from the worst of the last glacial maximum to the warmth of the Holocene, fluctuations in temperature were larger at the poles than at the equator. 21,000 years ago, northern Eurasia was about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius colder than it is today, but only 2 to 6 degrees colder in the tropics. At higher latitudes, changes in temperature caused large disruptions to prehistoric societies, making the coldest and driest lands uninhabitable, forcing some bands of people to move and killing others through drought and famine. Social and environmental instability triggered technological adaptations linked to shifts in stone tool types. In the tropics, on the other hand, human societies may not have been affected as heavily by environmental change. Admittedly, changes in the amount of precipitation did occur, and were related to the expansion and contraction at different moments of rainforest, woodlands, grasslands, and deserts. However, even during the driest periods of the last glacial maximum, large areas of rainforest remained, and most of South and Southeast Asia could still support human life. Generations of people living through this relative stability may have been able to maintain a consistent way of life, hunting and gathering the same plants and animals, rarely needing to adapt their tools. If correct, this theory suggests a fundamental difference between temperate and tropical human societies of the Pleistocene. Whereas humans in the north lived at the edge of the human range, vulnerable, demographically unstable, but adaptable, those in the south lived within the wet, tropical heart of the planet, safe and culturally static. In our next episode, we will explore in detail the remarkably stable economic systems of humans in the tropical forests of Asia. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of the show. Your support will allow me to continue bringing you our prehistory.